Good afternoon, and welcome to today's VetNet Entrepreneurship Track Hangout entitled Financing Your Enterprise. This is the third in our four-part series of our Social Entrepreneurship June series. My name is Mike Shenick, and I'm the Program Manager for VetNet here at the Institute for Veterans and Military Families located on the campus of Syracuse University. Prior to getting started, I will go through a few housekeeping notes. For those of you participating live within the Hangout, please feel free to speak up and voice your question at any point during the Hangout. Also, you can enact the chat function by hovering over the left side of your screen and clicking the icon. You can type your question into the comment box, and we will relay it to the moderator and to the presenters. For those of you watching out on our YouTube stream, please feel free to type your question into the comment box, and we will relay that as well. And finally, you can always type your question on the Google Plus event page, and I will be monitoring for those as well. So I will now turn things over to Stacy Ellen Keefe, who is the director of the Syracuse University IDEA. So Stacy, I'll turn things over to you, and then we'll go through our other introductions for our presenters.
Great, thanks, Mike. As Mike said, I'm the director of the IDEA office at Syracuse University, and the long name for that is actually the Raymond Von Dran Innovation and Disruptive Entrepreneurship Accelerator. So that's where the IDEA comes in. For 7 years, this office has existed, and I basically do for all SU students what IVMF does for veterans. So my job is to support the students at Syracuse University who have ideas, who want to start ventures, who came to us already from high school with ventures. Well, how do we take the next step? And I'm an academically neutral office, so I work everywhere in the university. I partner with everyone. We do this through classes, through a lot of events, class visits, events like Startup Weekend, which if none of you have been to one of those, I would strongly encourage a Startup Weekend. They have them all over the world, and they're great events. You meet great people. We also have a seed funding competition, so we actually fund our students to, startups. And we have a huge networking conference that was created 5 years ago by students for students. So we asked our customers, what do you need, what do you want, and we're going to build it. So that's what I do here at Syracuse University. It's academic entrepreneurship. We are a 501c3, so technically it's nonprofit entrepreneurship as well. Steve and Jen, who you're going to hear from shortly, have a lot of experience in this world, and they are the experts. So, Steve, why don't you start with your bio?
Sure. Steve Murchie. I'm currently co-owner and CEO of a software company called Envision Technology Partners. And most of my career has been spent in the software industry, in the corporate world. But about 8 years ago, I left that and got involved in a startup. And from that, started down the path of looking for angel investing, ultimately became an angel investor, and then led an angel investor group for about 3 years here in the Denver area. So I got a fair bit of experience working with the startup community and funding for-profit sorts of enterprises. But around the same time, I got involved with Social Venture Partners here in Denver, which, as we heard in an earlier session, is an organization that contributes time, talent, and treasure to nonprofits that are looking to increase their sustainability and grow their organizations. And so I spent a lot of time working with a variety of nonprofits and helping to understand their needs and assist their organizations. So I sort of found this middle ground between the for-profit world, not-for-profit world, and became very intrigued by social entrepreneurship and social enterprises, and have made sort of a study of that over the last 7 or 8 years.
That's great. Thank you, Steve. And so we'll be hearing a lot about funding and sustaining your social enterprises today, from all the way from Steve with venture capitalism and the angel investors. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we'll hear from Jen from the perspective of a community foundation and grants. So Jen, do you want to give us your bio?
Sure. My name is Jennifer Owens, and I'm the Vice President for Development and Marketing here at the Central New York Community Foundation, also located in Syracuse. The Community Foundation field, though, is nationwide, and most every geography that people could be listening or watching from will have their own Community Foundation, and I'll talk a little bit about that in my remarks. I've been in the field of philanthropy for 17 years. First at 2 different private foundations in the Washington, D.C. area, and then most recently I've spent 10 years here at the Central New York Community Foundation, both on the grant-making side as well as the fundraising side. So I've been on both sides of the ask, if you will, and that's my background here. Again, now I oversee development, so what I'll be speaking to really is talking a lot to where I'm in the same boat as the people who are listening to this.
Great, thank you. So we're going to hear a lot of options about funding and sustaining your social enterprises, and pros and cons to all of them, and you really have to decide what is best for you, personally, your venture, your market, what should you do. So Steve, do you want to start with your presentation?
Thank you. Yeah, this is kind of an abbreviated version that I've given a few times in a social entrepreneurship course here in a local college. And the discussion with students always sort of starts with, what sort of an organization do you want to be? And if we go to the first visual in the slide here, slide deck, the concept has often been, I don't think that is...
That's actually Jen's first.
Yeah, that's not my first slide, so sorry. Historically, the concept has often been, well, what kind of an organization do you want to be? Do you want to be a for-profit? Do you want to be a not-for-profit? And what I'll say is that that's really not the core question anymore, because with the emerging types of organizations that we have out there and the challenges facing both for-profit organizations to be more socially responsible and on not-for-profit organizations to be more sustainable, it really becomes a continuum that we have to look at in terms of what is the primary focus of the organization. And if we think of it as a spectrum, from being almost exclusively oriented to the financial aspects or the economic returns of an organization, then you can move to the next slide now, and versus being more oriented towards the social or environmental sorts of concerns on the other side. There's a spectrum there, and we need to look at maybe how the organization begins its focus and how it ultimately evolves over time. And irrespective of where you are on that continuum, you can move in either direction at different stages of your evolution. And we'll talk about different organizational concerns and different funders that'll be more appropriate for you depending on where you spend your emphasis on that spectrum. One thing that I will say is that as a not-for-profit organization or a primarily social or environmentally concerned sort of organization, then there are 2 things that I have heard stated. I can't take credit for these, but one is that if there is no money, there's no mission, and that's something I think has been very true in working with smaller nonprofit organizations that really need to focus on building their sustainability no matter what their development processes might look like. And so if you want to become a primarily mission-focused organization, then you still have to raise the money. The other one is that we need to think of this spectrum in terms of always looking at the sustainability of the organization from the perspective of, if you're a nonprofit, that is really just a tax status. It's not a business plan. And I see a lot of nonprofits end up in a scenario where their boards are driving them to actually end up with no profits at the end of the year. And that is not a sustainable model that they can use for survival. So we can move at least one slide forward. So that's just repeating that. Some of the other thoughts. One more slide, please. So some of the things that you'll be concerned about in getting a new organization started is that you always have to have some startup capital. And in most cases, it's going to come out of two sources. It's going to come out of the founder's pocket. That's your own startup capital. And most of us don't have a lot of that to start with. And so we next look at what startups will think of as the three F's. The friends, the family, and other fools who believe in your cause and will support you in your endeavors to get it launched. But then it sort of branches depending on what your orientation is. And if you're a more economically centric organization, you have angel investors that you can look towards, which are individuals primarily who seek to fund new and interesting startup ventures. There's the more institutional venture capital organizations. They have a lot stricter sorts of requirements that they're looking for typically, and most organizations are not good candidates for venture capital investment. Banks to get loans from, those tend to be even stricter in terms of who they will lend to, and those are often really dependent upon being at a certain stage of your growth and being fairly far along in being an established organization. And then finally, if you're making products and selling products, and customers are one of your very best sources to get a new organization launched. If you go more towards the mission-oriented organization, then you have to think about donors. You know, that's sort of generally the more individual-oriented contributions. There's the more institutionally oriented sorts of contributors, which could be foundations or family offices and so forth, and those can come in the form of grants. And then finally, the emerging area of what we'd call an impact investor. And so they would look at an organization that has a strong mission, but is also oriented towards building a sustainability model that will be able to support itself over time without continued donations. Move on to the next slide.
Steve, before we move on, I have a question there. Is it as simple as saying my friends, family, and other fools don't have enough money? I don't have enough money in my savings, so whether I'm socially or not, you know, bottom line, is that how I determine, wow, I actually need other sources of funding?
Yes, I think you need to start off with that process of looking at what resources you have available to you. Talking to the people that you know, talking to the people that they know, and potentially try to find the resources you need to get started through those channels. Now, it doesn't always mean going to somebody for a grant or an investment. Sometimes it can be and if you're building products, for example, it can be a partnership with somebody that would be representing you in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
That's often, channel partners are often a great source of investment for getting off the ground.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you.
Sure. So another thought is that organizationally, there are considerations depending on how you want to build your emphasis. The type of organization, S Corp is often an individual partnership, LLC, a limited liability corporation, a 501c3 or 5 or 6, depending if you're not-for-profit status. But that type of organization can impact funder decisions as to whether they would invest in you. So there may be the case that you have to have more than one entity in order to achieve the goals. So you may have to have a quote for-profit entity and a not-for-profit entity associated to the same business cause so that you can achieve your goals. There is a new type of business entity called a low-profit limited liability company. It doesn't exist in all 50 states yet, but it's definitely something to consider. It allows for essentially a for-profit tax status with the understanding that a fair amount of it is going to be contributed to mission-oriented causes. And the disclaimer advice here is definitely seek professional legal and tax advice before you make that final decision on the type of organization that you want to incorporate as. So from a sustainability perspective, the big question is always how are you going to finance your operations year after year? And in working with the nonprofit community, what we see is that there's a sort of treadmill that the organizations get on, having to obtain donations on a regular basis. And that becomes a development challenge for them year after year. And some are very good at that and some are not. And so thinking about how you as an individual can build an organization and sustain it, you might look at some of these other alternatives. Some core points are that unrelated business income, in other words, nonprofits can have income that's not related to their mission, is not a bad thing. And a lot of boards of nonprofits will discourage that, but from looking at a number of organizations that are very successful, it is not a bad thing. And having unspent income at the end of the year is not a bad thing as a not-for-profit organization. And so as you build your business plans and build your models, it's important to think about how you contain reserves and preserve those reserves from year to year. And sometimes, I just make this comment that it's appealing to a buyer's selfish interest can be more repeatable than appealing to a donor's selfless interest. And the thought there is that selling a product, people are buying products often for the utility of what that product delivers, not necessarily for whatever additional mission is being served by that product. If you're appealing only to a donor's interest, then they have to be repeatedly supportive of your mission rather than just the product that you deliver. And to the next slide. And so for measuring your success, I'd like to have people think of the bottom line in three tiers or three filters. The economic, which is easily measurable in terms of the accounting principles, but also the social and environmental sorts of measurements, which are reflected in a multitude of other ways. The challenge is often how do you measure your social impacts and how do you measure your environmental impacts. There is actually a new organization called a B Corp, which seeks to, and it's a certification, not a formal organizational type, and that seeks to help organizations measure and represent their achievement of those goals in each of those dimensions. So one of the important things is to make sure you quantify your outcomes, not your inputs. And the thought there is that in the mission-oriented world, it's often the case that we would measure how many clients we're touching, how many clients that we're serving. And that's not necessarily a direct indication of the outcomes. And so we also want to look at the next level of, well, of those that we served, how many of them achieve the goals of the organization in a measurable way. So ultimately those should be measured in terms of the impact of the organization, irrespective of how you want to form your organization. And just for some suggested reading, these are all sort of crossover sorts of authors. Yvon Chouinard, who's the founder of Patagonia, wrote a wonderful book on called "Let My People Go Surfing" about the foundation of that company and how he sought to make a socially responsible, environmentally sensitive company while building a strong corporate environment. A book called Corporate Capitalism. One name you might recognize here is John Mackey, founder of Whole Foods. Talk about how a capitalistic sort of, or a company that's built towards a primarily economic goal can also serve some very strong social and environmental purposes. And then the third one is Uncharitable, and it's by Dan Pallotta, who wrote a very interesting book on how serving the nonprofit community with a for-profit cause had some ultimately negative connotations to it, and his thoughts on how organizations can better achieve multiple.
Excellent. So, my master's is in public administration here at Syracuse University, and I got it about 11 years ago. And we were already talking about UBIT, unrelated business income tax, and even then it was a scary thing. Wow, I don't know about that. We should stay away from that. But I definitely see a change, especially here at Syracuse University, our Whitman School of Management, our Maxwell School of Citizenship, teaching students that you can have revenue streams within nonprofits. Nonprofits are businesses, and so one case study that I had read about a couple years ago that I absolutely loved was a nonprofit women's shelter, and of course they did what a lot of them do, rely on government grants, rely on community foundations, and a lot of us are competing for that. Grants dry up, especially in government, so they looked around at what assets they had. And, they have these women coming to the shelter who have been emotionally or physically abused, and most of them haven't worked. And so they looked around and they said, okay, we have all these women, and, this sounds stereotypical, but it worked for them. They were able to cook, but they also, anyone can shred paper. So what this shelter did was they started a professional paper shredding company. And they employed women from the shelter. And what that did was the women who had no experience on a resume at all suddenly could put down this job. And it helped them to actually get jobs and become financially sustainable and get out of their difficult situation. Same thing, they started a catering business as well. And it was along the same lines. I mean, it didn't take much to be trained by professionals to do this catering business, and then they had a resume. So this was, income for the nonprofit that, of course, they dealt with a different way than donations and everything, but then it gave their customers, their clients, the strength, the resume building that they needed to actually go out and be financially sustainable and independent. So it just tied back to their mission in so many ways, and it fed into their organization and got them off of reliance on grants that dried out. And I just thought that was a wonderful example of how nonprofits can create these non-traditional revenue streams that, when you look at them, actually make sense. There's a duh moment there. So it's just a fascinating world. And so, Jen, why don't you take us over to the world of the community foundation?
Sure. So if we can go to my first slide. Can people see that? I can't see it.
Yes. Yep, the arrow slide is up.
What type of organization you're going to be.
Hey, Jennifer, you're coming in a little spotty. Is everyone else having kind of a spotty? Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
And she just popped off. Okay, so we'll wait a second till she till she pops back in, and hopefully we can get this squared away.
Okay. While we're waiting, a quick question then for Steve. This is Gary Shaheen at IVMF. So, Steve, you know, we're thinking about small startup social enterprises, social entrepreneurial ventures. Sometimes we've heard, well, we don't have the capacity to actually go out there and do a resource development plan, and they consider hiring in a professional fundraiser. Can you tell us a little bit, while Jen comes back on, sort of the pros and cons of hiring an outside gun for hire, if you would, for resource development?
Well, it all depends on the type of organization that you are. There are, in the for-profit arena, there are definitely some legal concerns about hiring that kind of an individual. I think in the not-for-profit arena, hiring a professional development manager can be a good thing. It, again, has to be ultimately supplanted with a long-term sustainability model that allows you to build and grow your organization, you know, without necessarily going out and tapping on different donor doors. It looks like Jen's back, so we should get back to her.
Yeah, good. Okay, welcome back, Jen.
Hi, how's everybody? So when you're really getting to the brass tacks of creating your fund development plan, you want to think of a couple things. First, you want it to be very realistic, and you want it to be action-oriented. So if you kind of work backwards from your goal, and really kind of getting to a certain dollar amount, and you really need to back up and go through those steps one by one to make sure that what you're planning to do is actually going to have a likelihood of reaching you to that goal. And as you're working on your plan, you want to make sure that you're checking in on the plan over time. So you have a great group of volunteers. You'll have board members. You'll have other volunteers. You know, those friends, family, and fools that that Steve spoke about. Those are the people that you want to have on your team for this plan, and to really engage them in a meaningful way. And then you have to go out and do it. So you can also go to the point of spending too much time planning and not enough time actually doing. Many people get caught up in the idea of asking for money and that not being a comfortable thing, but you do have to get out and do it. And then at the end, you have to really cycle back around on the results to see if your plan did what it was intended to do. Next slide. As with anything, you really get what you put into anything, which includes fund development planning. So the more time you take to really be thoughtful about the plan, the more successful you'll be. And if we click to the next slide, we can talk about some considerations. The first thing that you really need to do is to create your case statement, so that everyone who's out there fundraising on your behalf and working to get you to your goal has the same basic fact set. So you need to have your mission and vision all established. You need to talk, you need to articulate really well what it is that you plan to do, so that people will feel like they want to jump on board and support you with their money. It really needs to be very specific. So $200,000, we need $200,000 is not exactly a plan. So what types of gifts are you going to need? How many of each different size of gift do you think you can realistically get? So is $200,000, will you be able to get that by, you know, going to, you know, Aunt Jane and your grandpa to get $100,000 each, or do you need 200 people to jump on board at $1,000 level? And only you and your board can really determine what the right mix is. You really need to use your volunteers well. If you try to do it all yourself, it will be very difficult, and you'll I think find that you'll burn out more quickly. If you're able to use volunteers and be comfortable with the fact that you're going to lose some control in exchange for being able to bring volunteers closer to your organization, if you give them meaningful work, you'll have more boots on the ground looking for those dollars, and you'll have a lot better chance of being successful. Next, I'd say let your passion show. One of the other things that can happen is you get into such an academic place with your planning for your fundraising that you forget to make sure that the way that you're speaking to people really pulls at their heartstrings and really speaks to them on a level that's a little bit deeper than just the business case for why your organization is important. Some of you may or may not be working on actual veterans issues with your social entrepreneurship ventures, but whatever it is that you're doing, make sure that you allow yourself to translate and transfer that passion to others. And then being accountable. So if you are looking to raise $200,000 and your plan lays out a specific measurable way you're going to do that over the next 12 months, you need to check in periodically to make sure that you are on track to reach that goal. If something goes awry during part of the implementation of that plan, you really need to course correct and say, okay, do we need to reduce the amount we expect to receive? Do we need to think about other things? You need to retool that plan along the way. Next slide. This quote is something that I kind of enjoy. Martin Luther King didn't get up 50 years ago and say, I have a budget and a plan. And that's just meant to speak to the need for each of you to really express and tell the story of what you're trying to do in a way that gets beyond the budget and the plan. While those are important things, many donors make decisions based on a mix of the business plan and the way that you speak to their intrinsic motivation. Next slide. So there's a very, I think, it can be intimidating to think about creating a plan like this, but when you look at the steps, you really need to begin by recruiting volunteers, getting those friends, family, and fools to begin with, but then also expanding that to their friends and family and the fools that they know. Those are the people that really can build that group of people that you need to be successful. Making sure that your mission, vision, and budget are very well thought out. So if you go into it just saying, oh, I think we need $200,000 to do what we want to do, make sure that you've really done the pro forma budgeting and articulated what it is you're trying to do and figured out what the true cost is to do that, so that you know that when you get to the end of the day, if you've told people raising $200,000 is going to get us where we need to get and we're going to be able to do this, that's actually what can happen. Because those early years especially are important to make sure that you're building the loyalty of your base by doing what you say you're going to do. Look at similar organizations. One thing that I see a lot with people who come looking to the Community Foundation for funding is that they don't look at other organizations that are doing similar things to see how they're doing it, to see what their successes have been, talking to them to find out what lessons they've learned so that you don't have to make the same mistakes to learn those same lessons. The other benefit to that is that you can see who funds those organizations. So finding out who funds similar organizations can be really helpful to you as you think about potential for your own organization. Look at the support you've had so far. So one way to make sure that you're able to sustain yourself is by looking at, well, what have I been able to do with what I've done so far, and if I scale that up, what more could I do? Setting a realistic goal. You may wish that your organization could start right out with a $500,000 budget because you want to do all these things, but there's definitely a benefit to setting something that you can actually fundraise and what you can actually secure. It'll keep your volunteers motivated, it will keep you motivated, and it will allow you to leg into the programming in a way that produces results that you can then go back to use to say, okay, now it's time to scale up, to go to the next level. Checking your systems. So one of the most difficult parts of implementing a fundraising plan is really figuring out how you're going to track and how you're going to keep track of all the moving parts. If you've sent 10 different people out with different charges of things to do, you're going to go ask 2 people for $1,000, you're going to run a golf tournament, you're doing this. You need a way to manage all of that and to keep track of what everyone says they're going to do so you can check in with them. You don't want to find out the week before the dinner that you think you're having that the invitations only went out, a couple of days before if that wasn't the plan. So making sure you are able to track. The next step is to really arm your professionals or your volunteers and if you have a professional fundraiser, with the information they need. So as things change, as your thinking evolves, make sure that you keep everyone in the loop about what the plan is, so that when people give money to your organization, that they have a really good understanding of what it is that's going to be done with that. One of the easiest ways to break donor confidence is to do something other than what you said you were going to do with the funds that they entrust to you. Set a timeline. As I mentioned, you can, I think, really keep your volunteers motivated by setting time-bound specific tasks to be completed over shorter periods of time, so that you can keep them motivated by showing success toward those interim goals, and then ultimately leading to your end goal. And then assessing your results and adjusting. When you find out that $100,000 grant that you thought you were going to get isn't going to come through, it's time to retool the plan. Next slide. So defining success. One of the things you want to think about in advance is, what will success look like? You may not raise $200,000 just because that was your plan in the first year, but there are many different ways to look at success when you're reviewing your fundraising. It's not only the amount raised, but it can be the number of new relationships. So sometimes building your base of donors can be just as important as how much they give, because it's easier. As many people who have run any kind of business know, it's easier to keep a customer you already have than to get a new one. So as you build those relationships, and you can pull those people up to higher levels of giving, but having those relationships means that there's that many more people that might be out there talking about your organization. Diversity of support is another important measure. So in a second, I'll talk about the mix between corporate donations, individual donations, grants, and then potentially grants from private organizations, and then potentially government support. So having a good diversity means that if you only get that one big government grant and the next year that grant is gone, there goes your organization as well. How long it took, you can use your time measurements to identify whether you've been successful. Engagement of your board. Many boards set an expectation that every board member gives at least something to the organization. So you can look to their engagement in terms of their own personal giving, but also their engagement of, were they willing to go out and do the asking for your organization? Were they willing to go out and get their family and friends to give? Do they believe enough in your mission and vision that it's not just something that they want their name on, but they actually want to go out and do that work? And then cultivating renewable sources. So making sure that your organization is not just putting yourself on a treadmill of constant fundraising, that there's over time going to be portions of your budget that you already can plan for before the year begins. Next slide. I guess because I'm in fundraising now, and I used to be on the fund giving away side of things, one thing I've definitely come to notice is that relationships are very important. So fundraising is not just about going out and asking people for money. Really, to cultivate those bigger gifts, you need to think of it as a marriage. You're trying to get toward marriage. So you start out by dating. You don't kind of show up to that first date and ask someone to marry you. So be patient. You're anxious to get going with whatever it is you want to do, but sometimes people take a little bit more cultivating to get to the place where you can ask for those bigger gifts. And oftentimes, if you push that relationship too quickly, the downside of that can be that you might receive a smaller gift than you might otherwise have received if you had been more patient and taken time with that larger donor. Next slide. This is, and Steve spoke to kind of the earned income, that UBIT issue that both he and Stacy mentioned. Earned income is nothing to be afraid of, as they mentioned. There are many organizations that have found different ways. One of my favorite examples is the Habitat for Humanity Restore. They realized that there was an opportunity for them to sell old building supplies and older appliances and things to be able to support their mission to build houses. So you really shouldn't be afraid of that earned income piece. Government, individual, and corporate, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. Next slide. A word of caution about government grants. Many of you will be especially eligible, perhaps, to engage with the government in grant making if you're going to be working on veterans issues with your social venture, but a word of caution will be that on the spectrum of different ways that you can raise money, one of the most difficult to manage and administer appropriately will be government funding. So there'll be lots of paperwork, there will be lots of reports that need to be submitted in a timely manner, and if there are reimbursements or things like that, there will often be delays in receiving those types of support. So it's not for the faint of heart to undertake the task of accepting a government grant if you actually receive one. Next slide. So a couple things about what foundations are looking for, and I'm actually thinking more about private foundations and community foundations. There are many different types of support that you can get from foundation, but really each foundation has its own personality, both literally and figuratively. There are different people at those organizations. They have different timelines. They have different core focuses, and so you really want to do your research. If you think there's a foundation that might be right for you, do your homework. Go to guidestar.org, visit the Foundation Center website, and do the research to make sure that you aren't wasting your time by submitting applications to organizations that are unlikely to support your work. If they suggest that you send a letter of intent first, send that letter of intent first. One of the sure ways to get in the disregard pile early on is by not following their procedures. Being clear about your case, make sure that you are able to talk about what you do very succinctly and in a way that engages them really quickly as they're reading through your materials. And know their deadlines and processes. One of the worst, most disheartening things is to spend weeks putting together an application and then to find out that the deadline was the week before or in 6 months, or so being sure that you're cognizant of that. And then next slide, community foundations. I would be surprised if you could, if anyone on this call or who listens to this later would be able to find a community that they're in that does not have a community foundation. And on this slide, I've listed the community foundation locator web link, so you can put in your zip code and find out what community foundation services your area. They're generally more accessible than private foundations because unlike private foundations, we're also fundraising entities, so we both raise money and give it away. And because I work at one, I'm going to tell you that they're full of great people who are willing to help you. And I have not met a community foundation that is not willing to meet, especially with people who are just starting out with new ventures, to talk through and give them advice. They also in your community will know who else is doing similar work to what you're doing and will be more than happy to connect you to that. And then finally, the last slide is a sampling of some of the resources that I thought might be helpful for all of you. One is the Wounded Warriors has a granting program for veterans serving nonprofits, and I included the link there for you to access that and learn more information. If you do decide that federal grants and government grants are for you, there is a website that the government has set up to be able to access all of the different open grants that are available. And then for doing your research, really the Foundation Center at foundationcenter.org is the biggest catalog of foundations, and you can search by keyword to find organizations that might help be willing to support your organization. And then of course Google. Dr. Google is always a helpful friend, and searching keywords for funding and the keywords of what your organization is going to do is never a bad thing. You may stumble across another organization that could be really helpful to you. And that's my final slide. It's got my direct contact information if anyone has questions or needs help with accessing their own local community foundation.
Great, thank you, Jen. So in my grant experience, I've worked with community foundations, I've worked with private foundations. I've found that, at least in my case, they're usually more successful if I've contacted the community foundation or the other foundation first and actually developed a relationship with someone there. They explain the application process better. They can tell me what are they looking for, so that, you know, I'm not wasting my time, but they're not either, reading through an application. So would you suggest that whenever possible, unless it says specifically don't contact us,
Right.
that you actually do try to reach out and get more information and kind of establish some kind of a relationship first?
Yes. I mean, I think it's similar to anything that you'd be doing. You're going to find that it's more difficult for someone to tell you no when, you know, it's easier for them to tell you no when they haven't actually met you face to face and helped you through the process. And because community foundations have that community-oriented outlook, it's really it's seen as our responsibility as a community foundation to help the fledgling organizations along. So we could be the funders of just the larger nonprofits that that have professional fundraisers, because they know how to do everything and they know how all the forms should be. But it's really our job to level the playing field and to make sure that we meet with folks and help them to move forward. Sometimes it's not even that they get a grant the first time, but maybe in the initial phases we're just connecting them with people who can help them refine their business plan, look at their budget, and really hone in on what it is they're trying to do, so that they can be more effective in the future with the community foundation and with other funders.
Great, and so we encourage the audience to actually type in questions for Steve, for Jen, for myself, so that we can give you all the information that you need. And because we realize too, a lot of things are specific to what you're doing, so feel free to, you know, ask us a question about, you know, what is your venture, and what fundraising, you know, funding, what should you look at, what should you be aware of? You know, I know that I read a lot about, you know, it's a myth that startups have to, you know, take out these huge loans and, you know, go to a venture capitalist, and I think that it really depends on what you're doing. Steve, would you agree?
Absolutely, and it's also the case that as a brand new startup sort of enterprise, those sorts of funders aren't going to be that interested in you.
Right, right.
And
you won't be able to get a loan because you don't have anything to lend against, and a venture capitalist won't necessarily be interested. The number of organizations that they fund are in the decimal percentages of startups that are out there. So your best bet is really to do it as a grassroots effort, start from the bottom and build up. And that's why, again, I like the idea of building sustainable enterprise that can start small and build without needing a lot of resources from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Mirza, you have a question?
Not a question, just a quick comment. Steve talked about the 3F, the friends, family, and the fools. And I think just to add to what Jennifer said about the board, I've been involved with some local non-for-profits, and we call it the 3G golden rule. The G stand for get, give, or get off. Meaning for the board members to either get money, get resources, give money and time and resources, and if you don't do those two, then get off the board and replace those folks with the ones who can do the number 1 or 2 or 2. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those rules we also use in addition to 3F. We have the 3G. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, Jen, do you have any suggestions? I've been on boards that are very small, and you know, the people on the boards don't necessarily have a bunch of financial resources. So, you know, you can have a culture of this kind of sliding scale. Do you have any, you know, advice on how to set that up? It's difficult for a lot of people to talk about that, to say to your board, I really want you to give. And, you know, if it's not a huge board where you're giving tens of thousands a year, you know, maybe, you know, and it's a sliding scale, how do you go about talking about that, setting it up, and what's fair?
Yep. We often encourage people to talk to their boards about giving a meaningful gift instead of putting a dollar figure to that. Some boards go to the point of saying give $1,000 or get $1,000 from someone, or this board is not for you, to Mizra's point. But when I talk to people, I think if they think about, we would like to be in the top 3 of your giving for the year. If we're not in your top 3, then we don't think that necessarily this is a great fit for you, because there are obviously other priorities that you have as a board member, and we're kind of just you know, the afterthought to your giving. So we ask for it to be meaningful. Some people use the term give till it hurts. So give enough that it's not just you're walking around coffee money, but that it's something that, you know, requires a little bit of discernment, but that you feel strongly enough as a board member that the organization's mission is worthy of making that type of commitment. And that's, I think, really all you can ask of your board. You may have board members that can give $25, but they bring a perspective that you really need at the table. And you may have board members that could give $100,000 and they're giving $1,000, and while $1,000 might be nice, you know that that's not a meaningful gift for them.
Right.
So I think that's a respectful way to have that conversation.
And, you know, I often tell students, you know, you're starting a nonprofit. Even if you've given $5, you know, if you haven't given and this is your passion, then why should anyone else?
Right, right.
So,
and it makes it easier for them to speak to it. If I go and ask my friend for money and I can't say that I've given myself, why would what would my expectation be for them? Why would I expect them to do something that I'm not even willing to do myself?
Exactly. So Gary, you have a question.
Yes, I did. So Jen talked about the resources that we could use to identify community foundations, but what would you suggest that a social venture does to identify angel investors outside of family or a board? You know, who else is out there in communities that are looking for good causes, and how would a director of a social venture go about finding them?
Always a challenge, and there are a lot of angel investors out there. They're not necessarily well organized. There are a few organizations that do have emphasis on social ventures. One is called Investor Circle. It's quite a large one. They look at pretty good sized investments into organizations that have a multi-purpose business plan. Generally, the best thing to do is ask around your community and see if you can tap into any of the startup activities, the startup weekends, and other sorts of organizations, and see who the investors might be, and if you can get an audience. The interesting thing is that, you know, if you've met one angel investor, you've met one angel investor. They all think, act, and have different sorts of criteria for what they'll invest in. And so it is or can be a long and arduous process to find the right investors for your organization and your mission. So don't be discouraged. Keep trying. Keep asking. And a big part of it is going to be honing your pitch so that it appeals to the right audience. And that often starts with coming up with the 30-second description of what it is that you're doing and making sure that it's crisp and compelling, so that when you're at those mixers or other sorts of events and somebody says, "What do?" you can answer that question very quickly.
Jen, are community foundations generally in the know about local angel investors at all?
Sometimes. One way to at least identify other people who are charitable in the community would be to look at the Community Foundation's annual report, see who gives to the Community Foundation, and most community foundations also publish the list of people who have what are called donor-advised funds under their umbrella, and that's individuals who have opted to have an account with a community foundation versus starting their own private foundation to do their grant making. And just by reading down through that list and sharing that list with your board and friends and volunteers, they may be sparked to think of, oh, I know, I know Jane Smith. I can reach out to her. I didn't realize that she had an account with the Community Foundation, and that obviously at least indicates that she's a charitable person. So I know her and I can reach out to her. So that's one, I think, way that, and then generally community foundations will also know about entrepreneurship centers and other things that exist in communities. So here in Syracuse, we have the WISE Center for women business owners or women entrepreneurs. And so there's things like that that people can, at least help refer you to.
Yeah, and I mean, speaking just for the Syracuse community, I'm sure other communities are similar. Our local version of the Chamber of Commerce would be a good resource to go to for local entrepreneurs, because they do know some of the angel investors and the groups and the venture fund that actually just popped up here. And also in Syracuse, the Small Business Association also knows of these groups as well, and all of us try to get together so that we keep each other informed. But I have to think that in other communities, certainly the Chamber, if not the SBA, know or hear of other angel investors that people can go to as resources.
And even if they won't tell you, just having them educated about what you do means that when they're speaking with those folks, even if they won't tell you, oh yeah, you should go see Steve, he'll help you out, they will have that story in the back of their mind, so that when they're talking to people and they say, we're looking for some new things that we can support, they'll have your story in the back of your mind. And to Steve's point, if you've come up with a compelling, easy way that people can remember what you do, that will stick with them at all the more kind of top of mind for them.
Yeah, and that's a great point. It's one thing that our students certainly struggle with, because they're afraid of talking about their ideas for fear that other people might steal them. But it really works out that the more people you talk to, the more connections you make, the luckier you get. The more opportunities open for you, because like you said, people know about you in the back of their head. You're there, so as they're networking, they're accumulating their friends, and they pass them on to you as well. So it's an excellent point. So Gary had another question, Jen, for you. Do community foundations generally require a match? And can you explain what is meant by the match and the forms it can take?
Our community foundation does not require a match, although I have seen many funders that offer a match. And I wouldn't say necessarily that they require it, but often you can ask organizations to provide you with matching dollars, so that they can say to the next foundation or to the next donor, we have this challenge grant. Most people call them challenge grants now. We have this challenge grant from the XYZ Foundation, and for some reason, psychologically, people are giving to something that is going to, quote unquote, double their money. And in that process, it kind of becomes this thing that gives a sense of urgency to the other donations that you're looking for. And in addition to that urgency, it also makes people feel like in some ways that they're getting a deal, if you will, by helping you pull down these matching dollars. But that said, all foundations do like to see that you have other support. So even if you can only go to a foundation and say, our board is fully committed to supporting this, and we've done X, Y, and Z to fundraise in our local community, and now we're looking to you to support it. It is difficult to get those first dollars, but if you can show that support is building for your organization, you're going to have a better chance.
Okay, so Jay has a question. He says that he's had a lot of success recently with companies donating services in lieu of money. When starting up, this kind of service can actually reduce cash outlay to get going, and that's absolutely true. We actually, my office had a $3 million grant from the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation 7 years ago now, and they actually had a 5-to-1 match, which is pretty steep, but I thought that their reasoning was excellent in that they said, you need some skin in the game. We don't want you to create programs that aren't going to be sustainable when this 5-year grant is over. But to Jay's point, part of that 5-to-1 match could be services in lieu of actual cash outlay, and it helped us tremendously.
Yep. Yeah, you may be able to get people to support you with help with your business plan, even help writing your development plan. There definitely are ways to get some of that in donated time instead of actual dollars.
Excellent. So it looks like we only have about a minute left before 2 o'clock. So does anyone else have any further questions? Or Jen, Steve, do you have anything that you want to add?
No.
Didn't have any wrap up. No.
I think. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you, Stacy, and thank you to Jen and Steve for presenting today. The content was great. So I'd like to remind people of a few things. Next week, June 24th, Tuesday at 1 p.m. will be our fourth and final presentation entitled External Operations, where we will be discussing market and mission, moments of truth, positioning, and research techniques. This series has been great, and we're thrilled to have been able to host it through VetNet and through the Institute for Veterans and Military Families. A reminder that all of these presentations have been archived out on our YouTube channel, which can be found by searching VetNet Entrepreneurship Track. And you can also subscribe to that and get all future presentations, notifications of all future presentations. In addition, we have a number of past entrepreneurship presentations out there for your use. So I will wrap things up again by just thanking all of the participants today, as well as our presenters. Great hangout, and I look forward to working with you all in the future. Have a great afternoon.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.